I imprinted on role-playing games a certain way in the early 80s. And in my mind, that's how role-playing games were. That's what a role-playing game was. And then to me, it seems like things are changing as time goes on. But really, it's kind of not. There may be a shift between how many people adopt one play style versus another, but the fundamental core differences in what people perceive or want out of it have been there since the beginning. And that's, to me, that's very, very interesting.
Shall we play a game?
Why, yes. I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Getting geeky in Little Rock, it's Shane Plays Geek Talk, a journey into the things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. Thanks so much for joining. And this week, I've got a returning guest who is it's always a pleasure to have on the show. Not only is he just a really nice, fun guy to talk to, but he's a genuine expert. And he can go deep in ways that you wouldn't even imagine on the subject of wargaming and RPG and tabletop history. And how it's all evolved and how you think maybe it has happened, really didn't. And, you know, he's got a very scholarly approach. In fact, as I was telling him before we started, yes, and I'm teasing you on who it is, folks, if you didn't read the title card, but I was in my previous podcast, Michael Bottolato of Frog God Games and North Texas RPG Con was raving about his approach to scholarship, how when he produces something, the scholarship on it is impeccable. So, of course, we're talking about Jon Peterson of Playing at the World, the book, and Playing at the World, the blog, among other things. And he has a new book coming out that we're going to be talking about that I will let him introduce to you. But Jon, how the heck are you? And welcome back to Shane Plays.
Oh, well, Shane, thanks for having me, man. It's always a pleasure to be here. And, you know, props as well to Bad Mike. I love visiting him down there in Dallas. I wish in better times I could have been there this past year. And let's cross our fingers that we'll be able to make it.
I hope to
year.
make North Texas this year. We actually talked about that. He said that they, you know, I didn't go, although I really came close because all I have to do is just drive up there. I wouldn't have had to take a plane or anything. But it's still, we were being very cautious about COVID. But they actually ended up saying, hey, if you have to travel to come here, don't come. And he said that they had about 80 people and they still had a really good time. But as they put out, they literally couldn't stop because their contract with the hotel, if they would have canceled the contract, then they would have lost that ongoing, you know, yearly spot. So they just went ahead and went on with it. And they said they had a good time for what it was. So
I would have loved to have been there. Always a great show. Just so intimate. The thing about that show is, like, you know, the ratio of special guests to attendees is so phenomenal that you just get to hang out with all the classic guys who show up and gals. It's it's an amazing show. Yeah,
there's going to be if people listen to both podcasts in a row, they're going to hear a lot of North Texas is great because it made a huge impression on me. Like I told Michael, I said, if somebody designed a con for me, it would be that. Like if they studied me and said, we're going to create a convention, it would have been that one. So, but we had a really nice conversation. It was Michael and Carl Heil came on and we talked a lot about Frog God Games because I hadn't had an episode yet to tell people about Frog God Games and Swords and Wizardry and everything. But we also talked a lot about OSR, what OSR is, the current state of the OSR scene and all that. So it was a lot of fun. But that was last episode. This episode, what do you got? What do you got coming up new for us? You got an exciting new thing.
I got a new thing. I do. I have this book coming out that's called The Elusive Shift, and the subtitle of it is How Role-Playing Games Forged Their Identity. And this really, it's actually, I guess, a sequel or a bit of an extension to Playing at the World. And this is something that, you know, people have asked me about time and again, like, you know, the coverage is really great, and then it like totally runs out of steam in like 1977, which is true. Playing at the World is really my attempt to show all of the context that I could possibly find for how D&D came into being and role-playing games kind of became a thing, right? And so the instant that they kind of became a thing is when Playing at the World pretty much stops. And so, you know, thinking about this and like what would it be like to kind of apply the documentary methods, the research methods that I have to what the next few years were like. I kind of toyed with a bunch of different approaches to that over the years, but it was really the fault of a guy by the name of Jonathan Tweet that got me started down this particular path. For those of you that don't know him, Jonathan, of course, was one of the designers for the original Ars Magica, Over the Edge, but probably is best known to D&D audiences as a lead on 3rd edition D&D, who was brought in by Peter Atkinson to work on that. And in 2013, actually, I was over at Peter's house for Halloween in Seattle. And Peter, invited Jonathan. I'd never met Jonathan before. I love Ars Magica, and I love, 3rd Ed D&D. I ran a lot of 3rd Ed D&D in the 2000s. And so I was totally already a little awestruck, hanging out with Jonathan for the first time. And we were playing some board games, and he knew kind of who I was and what I worked on. And he started asking me these, really pointed historical questions. I think he was actually trying to throw me off in the game, right? And he was like, so what was the first game that you think tried to simulate the structure of a narrative instead of the physics of a world? And, that's a really interesting question. It was really the starting point for the Elusive Shift when I started thinking about, and this is a question that's, of course, a very loaded one to post-OSR people, right, to people that look at story games and things like that, because, there's a contingent out there that maintains that, there's kind of a fundamental divide between early games like D&D that were kind of building a sandbox of physics to show how, combat and magic and things like that work. And to try to make that realistic to what a world of, swords and sorcery would be like. But then there's another group that kind of looks at these games really they're focused on generating a great story, right? Having a spontaneous story emerge from the people sitting around a table. And so that's the reason why the question's fraught, really, is because of the perception of that kind of broad cleave, right, between these two kind of styles of gaming. And, my initial reaction to it when Jonathan posed it was saving throws to me don't really simulate a property of a physical world. And this may itself be a controversial statement, I don't know, but, because when you read what people like Gygax wrote about it, and I'm thinking about the things he wrote in the AD&D books, late in the 70s, he really talked about how saving throws were there to represent the way that someone like a Conan in his stories could always have a chance to survive, right? No matter how bad the situation was. And that was kind of the property of D&D that saving throws were intended to simulate. And I think that's more a property of a story than a physical world. So this is what got me started. It's a pretty long anecdote about how I got started on it. But this led me down all kinds of different rabbit holes and all kinds of different investigations of this. And really what it tries to do is take the story up to 1980 or so and to talk about how once the term role-playing game got traction, what people really thought it meant, or what they thought made that game different from the war games and, in some respects, the practices in science fiction fandom that are also fascinating, right, that were going around at the same time as war games. I'm thinking here of things like the Midgard phenomenon would be a good example. What really made these things different? So the Midgard thing, this is a whole other story that Playing at the World goes into quite a bit. But this was the other fantastic medieval campaign game that was going on around the time that D&D was taking shape. It started, the English language version of it anyway, started around 1971. A guy named Hartley Patterson started a play-by-mail game that had the ability for people to take on a character, like a hero or a wizard, to adventure in a game world that Hartley Patterson ran and designed, and to potentially cast spells, to be able to find magic items, defeat monsters, increase in power as a result of it. It's really the closest cousin to D&D that was evolutionarily separate from it. And so it's a really fascinating game for people who are historians who kind of look at the context around D&D. And a lot of Elusive Shift is really, insofar as it does deal with kind of the pre-D&D stuff a bit, it's mostly to show the interesting set of things that were going on that were kind of getting at these ideas of playing characters, being in character, and the points where people detected what they were doing wasn't really wargaming anymore. And you start to see that around the time that D&D was taking shape. And for me, there's always, these things are always in a context. There's always a broader set of cultural influences that are kind of steering these practices. And, it just so happened D&D hit the magic formula of those and really just caused this tremendous transformation.
D&D. I mean, there was intentionality behind getting it out as a game, but it was also a perfect storm. It all just sort of came together at the same time. So the Elusive Shift, and you're putting it right in the title. It's elusive. When did it shift from tabletop gaming or board gaming or war gaming to role playing? So that's and to me that's fascinating, because this is the kind of conversation that a lot of people in the hobby have a lot. Over the years, I've gone from being a player to an armchair historian, kicking around, because it's had such a profound impact, not just on my life, but on our culture, pop culture and otherwise. There's literally, I've had people tell me that D&D saved their life, Yeah. So it's fascinating to me to talk about, when did it make that jump from, and I'm dumbing this down, from wargaming to role-playing gaming.
Yeah, and I think the world talks about this a bit, and that it was kind of an accident, you might say, in the sense of, the term role-playing got attached to these games. And the first place it was really popularized was towards the end of 1975. SPI, they had this magazine called Moves. Yeah, SPI, they were the board wargaming company who ran Strategy and Tactics magazine, right? Most famously, they had a side magazine they published on alternate months then called Moves. And, Moves had a lot of game reviews and convention reviews, and kind of like right after Origins in 75, right after the Tomb of Horrors, right after D&D had been showing off kind of what it was to the community in Baltimore. And at a time when now there were other games than D&D. Now at Origins in 75, they had Empire of the Petal Throne to show.
Right.
And over in Arizona and California, Ken St. Andre just started showing off this thing he called Tunnels and Trolls. So there was like a tradition of these things. And it was those reviewers who kind of looked at this and said, what is the aspect they have in common, right? And you would hear them throw around these adjectives. They're boardless, they're freeform, and they're role-playing. And really, role-playing seemed to have gained its currency through that, particular set of SPI reviews. And this
interesting. Okay.
Yeah, the Strategic Review then picked it up by early 1976. And this is all stuff I covered in Playing at the World. The one really interesting thing that is new in Elusive Shift that I hadn't seen yet when I did Playing at the World. The problem with working with these tens of thousands of fanzine sources, which is what I really do, is that there's always stuff you miss, right? There's always more you can mine from this. There's a fascinating, slightly earlier conversation where Gary Gygax was commenting in the letter column of a magazine on reviews that George Phillies had written of D&D, where he was kind of talking about it adding a new fourth category to the gaming community. Previously there had been board war games and miniature war games and diplomacy, and now there was this new thing from D&D. And, Phillies talked about in that what he called the Rommel syndrome. And this is something wargamers are talking about quite a bit. The players who get so into playing like Africa Corps, right, that they think they're taking on the character of Rommel and commanding these forces and that. And they have this identification with Rommel, which, was in some ways problematic. In some ways, people thought it was silly, right, that you would get that kind of engaged with the particular character of the commander. But when Gygax picked up and replied to this, he said that what Phillies was taking away from this as kind of the most exciting part of D&D was what he called the role-playing component. Now, what that meant to Gary was the wish fulfillment, the notion that you're going to be able to be this super powerful person. And Gary actually, interestingly enough, this was in July of 75, so a little before these reviews appeared in Moves, Gary kind of downplayed that and said, no, I disagree that that's the part of D&D that's engaging, this role-playing component. He thought it was an endless game of puzzle solving, that there was always a new, challenge, and that's what made the game engaging, rather than this possibility of kind of projecting yourself into a particular character. But ironically, Richard Berg from SPI, who's one of the people writing those reviews and moves, he was also reading that zine. So actually, I now think probably Berg picked this up from Gygax. Interestingly enough, from this kind of one-off comment that Gygax made. So that's new in Elusive Shift, stuff that's not in Playing at the World.
So literally the term role-playing was kind of fragile, and that's what it would have ended up being called. That's what it ended up being called, but some mentions in a publication from SPI seem to have been the the grit that the pearl formed around, I guess, or whatever.
As far as I can tell, and the other factor, and this is something that Patwa talks about quite a bit, is that, people like Ken St. Andre, who were trying to get their Tunnels and Trolls popularized, they wanted to be able to talk about it like it was a D&D-like game, right? And so Rick Loomis of Flying Buffalo took over as Ken St. Andre's publisher. He would be advertising for Tunnels and Trolls and would be invoking the name of D&D. Well, this provoked cease and desist orders from the people in Lake Geneva. And as a consequence of that, those people started settling on, well, no, it's a role-playing. It's role-playing, yeah. And people just heard in that role-playing means a game like D&D, right? Because it had already started to be kind of cemented that way. And of course, Metamorphosis Alpha by the end of 76 would be using role-playing in its description rather than wargaming. And then Holmes Basic, of course, famously would describe itself as, these rules for this fantastic medieval role-playing game.
Yeah, if I remember right, some of the earlier stuff, when they were still kind of juggling, they would refer to it as fantasy gaming, or you're sparking some memories that you look on the other stuff and they've got all these different ways to describe what it is, and then of course, and I'm not going into this on this podcast, but there's also the ongoing debate. It's settled a little bit, but it's still out there, of role playing, ROLL, versus role-playing. Like Gary's early adventures would have been more role-playing. I'm rolling the dice and try to solve the puzzle. Please send hate mail to notshane@gmail.com. Whereas role-playing is more where you're assuming not just the role of this character is ongoing from game to game, but I'm assuming the persona. I'm assuming how would I act as that character. I'm living in this character's shoes. The ROLE playing aspect, which, like I said, you could play it however you want. Today's focus in role-playing games to me seems a lot on narrative. A lot of the games out there and the game style seems a lot more on narrative. And, you have entire sessions that don't have combat and that sort of thing. And that's there's nothing wrong with that. If people are enjoying that, have fun. But I'm still much more at heart a kick down the next door in the dungeon and see what's behind there kind of player,
And definitely I go after the origins of things like ROLL playing as a label in Elusive Shift. I'm really fascinated by the first times people invoke things like that distinction. So you'll see a couple of places actually drop that. And similarly, I go after the places where people really started talking about story and immersion. And one of the things that may be surprising to readers of the Elusive Shift is how captivated people were by this possibility of storytelling and of having, kind of narrative mechanics even in very early games. And so partly Elusive Shift goes and mines, roughly 50, I'd say, RPGs that were published before 1980. And really looks at all of them to try to find kind of where they fell along the spectrum. So you were talking about Gary and his dice. Famously in Strategic Review in 76, Gary has an article where he talks about what happens when a character is going to be killed because of a bad die roll. And he uses the phrase, let the dice tell the story, right? He allows the possibility of divine intervention for truly worthy characters, which is a bit of an escape valve from that. But he really toes that hardline view of no, the dice say this person's killed, kill them. And you see those words reiterated. For example, in a very small press game called Realm of Yalmi. It came out in 1977. It's not a very well-known RPG, but I looked for everything that was kind of a self-described RPG that got published in this period. And you see them saying this precise line. But then, if you look at a Bunnies and Burrows has a very different philosophy about that, where it really talks, about, of course, at North Texas, if you went to North Texas, you were able to talk to Dr. Dennis Starr, who's a frequent guest there.
He was standing right next to me several times. Yeah,
right.
Yeah, my friend I took with me, who's a massive GURPS player and other stuff, I didn't know that he had a meltdown when he saw that the creator of Bunnies or Burrows was there. So, I didn't even know that he was a burner, but he lost his mind when he saw that guy was there. But anyway, I did.
Well, and he created the Druid class, right? His group, he was part of this amazing group in Madison, Wisconsin. Lot of key gamers came out of that group who were kind of early adopters of D&D. And the Druid class derived from Dennis's work with those guys. But, if you read Bunnies and Burrows, it really tells you, especially when it comes to saving throws, and saving throws are kind of a special thing I noticed in a lot of these early rules, that maybe the DM should use a bit of shade, right? To save a rabbit who might otherwise be killed in a circumstance that you're doing a saving throw. But, it stresses how important it is to retain the illusion of danger for the players.
One of the things I want to follow up on is the saving throw philosophy that you mentioned, the Gary Gygax's original saving throw philosophy. I think most players, including myself, for all these years have thought, well, saving throw is just another chance to die or have something terrible happen. But Gary's philosophy was here's a chance that I'm giving you not to die. So that's very interesting to know that that's where that mechanic came from. And talking about the old, let the dice tell the story, that's kind of what I came out of. I was playing in the 80s, and if you died, you died. I joke around somewhat hyperbolic, but not exactly. It's don't even name your character or give them a backstory till level 3, right? It's because you could get one-shotted, kid. But yeah, it kind of shows, Gary, as massively important as he was to the hobby, him and Dave Arneson and others, he was very much coming out of that wargaming sensibility. If your boat sinks, dude. That's what the dice said, right? Whereas, several generations later and several iterations later, there are people out there that are kind of horrified by that type of, what? I spent all this time on this character and it's dead? What? So.
Well, I guess maybe what the Elusive Shift will talk about that may be surprising to you then is just how early the counter philosophy to that emerged. Like I said, Bunnies and Burrows,
okay.
Like I said, Bunnies and Burrows really tells you not to let the dice tell the story. It really tells you instead, if you want to preserve this rabbit and you're the GM, fudge that roll. Don't let the players know you fudged it, but fudge it. And one of the biggest advocates of this, and this really surprised me when I was doing the research, was Ed Symbolist, the designer of Chivalry and Sorcery. Now, Chivalry and Sorcery is a very crunchy, kind of simulation-based game, but when you read his essays about how he ran it, and he has this amazing series, these Kismet essays that he ran through Alarms and Excursions, it really started 78 into 79. He basically says that as the referee, you have a responsibility to propel the story forward. And when you read him talking about this, you would think you're reading something that's post-Forge. You would. It's amazing. He's so, I should caveat that a bit because, he really does still deal in that illusion, right? And making the players think that everything is being adjudicated in a very mechanical way. But as a referee, he tells you totally throw that to the wayside. Your job is to create, the story of Sinbad, and the story of Sinbad, Sinbad's going to win and the princess will love him and he'll defeat his adversaries. And it's really just a question of how you kind of get to your fate. So he calls these the Kismet essays. And so, as far as I'm concerned, the pre-1980 literature is absolutely full of exactly this controversy. We're still litigating 40 years later. And we think about it one's super old school and one's new school. I really don't see it that way. And partly I don't, again, because when you point to these other phenomena that were going on around the time that D&D was coming together, good example of this is this Western gunfight game that I write about a ton in the early parts of Elusive Shift. Western gunfight was Old West simulation.
Okay, and to be clear, we're not talking about Boot Hill or something. It's called Western Gunfight.
Yep, and this came out. Okay. First print of this came out in 1970. This is a British game, and so you would read about it in Wargamers newsletter. And trust me, Gary read about it and was even commenting on this stuff in Wargamers newsletter. So he was reading this as it came out. And they had this notion of developing these kind of Old West campaign scenarios. But they very quickly gravitated to a set of stock characters, and everybody had their stock character. And it was really about having this ongoing campaign where, you would be playing from the results of the previous thing and kind of what happened to your character, and the last one would carry over to the next one. And it got to the point where, and this was, again, right as D&D was taking shape early in 73, one of them wrote this article into Wargamers newsletter called, "But Is It Really Wargaming?" Because he knew that people, he hit against a boundary. And, he wasn't sure really what it was they were doing anymore. And he ends that article by sketching this whole scenario, describing a situation of a soldier who's lying down in the dust, waiting for an ambush that's going to happen, and then poses to the readership, what do you do? just asking people like write back to him and get into that dialogue already. Because these things were happening so much like around D&D as it came out, there was already this kind of story-driven, our objective isn't to win anymore, they would say. The victory is no longer the objective. The objective is to have an ongoing, cool Western story. Like, and as soon as you get to that, like, you know, it all goes out the window, right? Everything changes when that's the way you start looking at the game.
I think that, you know, and I haven't thought this through, but like an initial thought I have is, I think the objective of why you're playing is probably a very important thing to look at to know what kind of game you're playing. You know, because it's like, well, my objective is to beat your army. You're probably wargaming. If your objective is to have fun and tell a good story, you're probably role playing. You know, and I'm saying probably because you always have to leave room for nuance and how other people see things. One thing you mentioned earlier is you were talking about what is the mechanic like. Are we doing mechanics for wargaming, or are we doing mechanics for physical world, or are we doing is the game mechanics about storytelling? And what I thought of when you said that was, you know, in interviews that I've read or watched with David Wesley, when he's talking about Braunstein, and he's got a really good, I don't know if you've seen Secrets of Blackmore yet,
Sure.
but there's a really good coverage of that gaming group, David Arnes's gaming group. The way that David Wesley describes what happens, because he set up kind of I'm not going to go into the history of Braunstein here, but let's, in very broad strokes, he kind of had a war game set up, or an intrigue type game that would have been very mechanical. But players kept coming in and saying, well, I want to bribe the mayor, or I want to do this, or I want to do that. And he's like, whoa, this wasn't what I was expecting. So he thought his game had gone off the rails, but what he had accidentally done was kind of go into role-playing with his players. And so he started having to come up on the fly with rules to do the social dynamics. So that intrigued me, because you were talking about, you know, at what point are you designing for the storytelling? And a proto role-playing game was already doing that. I mean, he was having to do that on the fly.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at where that went, right? I mean, Braunstein then became this game they called Brownstone that Dwayne Jenkins ran in the Twin Cities, right? Which was a Western campaign.
Yeah.
And this Western campaign, and if you really look at this Western gunfight stuff I'm talking about in England, up against, you know, what they were doing around the same time in the Twin Cities with Brownstone, you'll see tremendous similarities between these things. And like, I mean, this to me really just points again to the fact that this was something that was a movement that was happening in multiple places. Now, it so happens just from the causal chain, the Braunstein to Brownstone to Blackmore to D&D is the way, the main way at least, that got injected into D&D. But the people who then got D&D after it came out and tried to figure out, what do I do with this? Maybe there were people who knew the Western gunfight game. Maybe there were people who knew this Midgard game I was talking about. Maybe there were people who knew any of a set of similar things that were out there. And this was all part of this commons that then people kind of negotiated through. Well, okay, how do you use D&D as a tool? And I think you were exactly right to point to the question of what people are trying to get out of the game when they go to it, and kind of what the results will be. And, you know, in the post-Forge world, famously, people talk about this threefold model, right? The GNS model, where you have the gamist, the narrativist, and the simulationist perspectives on this. And one of the things that I was really amused by doing Elusive Shift was, you know, I found someone in 1971, a wargamer, who developed a typography for war games and what people were trying to get out of them. That said, okay, there's kind of basically three categories of people who are playing these war games. There are people who want to create really intense simulations, right? And like simulate down to the nth degree of detail, everything about them. They want to paint their miniatures with exactly the right colors and make sure, you know, you measure distances and you are accurately simulating the effect of this kind of gunfire or whatever. He says on the other extreme, there are people who are competitors. And these competitors are people who just want to win. They'll game the rules any way they can. Like they're looking for loopholes. They're really just focused on prevailing, like at any cost. And then there's like, what he considers the mainstream fun wargamer who considers this a cool pursuit, just wants to sit down and play a game and isn't overly obsessed with any of those kinds of details. So even in 1971, way before we asked these questions about like how do you divide up role-playing games, there were already people who were developing or perceiving these typographies. And beyond that, there were people who were then applying this and saying, look, you can't say there's a one true way. You literally, like before D&D came out, you can find people looking at just that model of wargaming and writing, it's kind of relative. Like, to the simulator, somebody who's really interested in this period pieces, they would play the competitive game and say you're getting it all wrong. And like the competitor would be like, I don't know, you're wasting your time worrying what color, red to use for the flag for this particular army unit. And like neither of them are wrong. We just have to recognize that there are people with these conflicting incentives that are going to sit down around the same tabletop. And that, you need to have some perspective, some relativism about it. And like, of course, that was part of the, theoretical legacy that the people who, took up D&D inherited. And you see those kind of typologies reemerge in manifold forms, even before 1980.
There's nothing new under the sun.
There's nothing new under the sun. That is usually my motto, yes. Whatever it is.
Yeah, human nature is human nature. We like to think of things as being different back then, or D&D popped out in a vacuum. And as important as D&D is, it did not pop out of a vacuum. But that leads me to a topic I want to hit real quick. And then we're going to talk about the Elusive Shift, which is, more of like the meat of what the Elusive Shift is content-wise, why you've written it. People think that, now we have the internet and we have Twitter and we have forums to debate all this stuff. That stuff was happening in fanzines and zines and newsletters. So why don't you take a couple of minutes and, keep in mind that some people that listen to my show, it's a it's not just an RPG podcast. Although I cover that a lot. I like to introduce new topics to people. Tell us about the importance of zines and fanzines, not only to your research, but to the hobby. I mean, is it fair to say that they were the internet of their time?
It is fair to say that. I mean, you're asking the right guy to talk about that. That's something I'd spend a whole hour just expounding on how awesome I think zines are. I mean, so yeah, zines were the intellectual commons, the republic of letters through which people discussed what these games meant, how best to approach them, gave reports on how they were doing with their approaches to them. There's just no substitute. I mean, if the things that are just published on a regular schedule that you see month by month, how these ideas evolved, right? How people interacted with each other. I mean, it helps you see how little anything is really in the vacuum, how little anything is isolated. Everything is part of this messy interchange and people bashing up against one another. And it's really, in the pre-internet era, there were only a couple things that provided that property. There were zines and there were cons, right? Conventions were a place where you could get together and play with someone and understand, okay, I now know D&D because like Rob Kuntz ran it for me and now I get it. But zines were equally efficacious, if not even more prevalent in really just spreading the gospel of here's how I did this and it worked. And so, I mean, there were zines that were extremely small press, that were extremely amateurish. I track hundreds and hundreds of these in the periods I studied from the 60s and 70s up into the 1980s. Some of them went for hundreds of issues. Some of them were just little flashes in the pan. But like by kind of putting a composite record of them together, you really get a sense of who did what when, a paper trail that's just unbeatable if you're trying to do research into how a phenomenon like D&D came about.
So yeah, it was the meeting place and the debate place and all of that. And what's fascinating, you'll see these people find nuggets of history. They'll see a major game creator who they were just posting something in a zine like, hey, I'm looking for players. Or, it was just where it happened. These newsletters and the zines, a lot of companies would have their own newsletter. You mentioned SPI, TSR had, was it Alarums and Excursions?
TSR had the Strategic Review and then the Dragon, of course, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Who did Alarums and Excursions then? I thought that was a TSR one.
Hey, no, that was California fans, actually science fiction
okay.
people in
For some
LA.
reason, I thought that was an official one. Okay. Well, it gets referenced a lot. I
Yes.
hear alarms and excursions, mentioned a lot. So I assumed it was an official one. But
I mean,
yeah,
it was really the first big zine that was about D&D itself, right? There were a couple campaign zines before that of people just reporting, here's what happened in the Rift this week out of Detroit or whatever.
Yeah.
But Alarms was the first place that was like, hey, write in and let's just talk about D&D and how it works and what you're doing with it.
I always listen to the Save for Half podcast. It's a fantastic podcast. But they had a discussion on there one time about you almost had to learn how to read a zine because space was so tight that there was like all these acronyms and things that is that true? Was it just like LOL level on the internet, or was it was almost like you had to understand shorthand to read some of these zines if I understood what they were saying?
I mean, actually, I think Roger Ebert, the late great Roger Ebert, the film critic, he wrote an essay you can probably find online. I forget what it's called, about how all of online vernacular culture started from science fiction fanzines. All the abbreviations, all the things that we kind of take for granted, that type of discourse emerged from it. And yeah, it was partly because space was at a premium. You didn't have a lot of room. Usually you had to reproduce these things yourself, right? It wasn't, in a zine like Alarms and Excursions, you would make if they printed 100 copies of an issue of Alarms, you would have to make 100 copies of your article and send it to Lee Gold, who was the co-leader for it. This is a particular kind of zine that's called an APA, an Amateur Press Association. And these have been popular in science fiction fandom like forever, but and I think actually you could send your stencils to Lee, or even get her to retype it if she liked you or you paid her, right? But for the most part, you were expected to kind of make your own and send it in, and then she would staple them together into an issue of Alarms that would get sent. Yeah. And that's how these things worked. So, and so there was a lot of jargon to it, and they are hard to read as well because of MCs, mailing comments, the way they do threads. Basically, like anytime you submitted to an APA, you would have a section of mailing comments that would refer to the previous mailing, maybe the last 3 mailings of issues of the zine, and that means if you hadn't gotten a chance to comment recently, and kind of address each one, maybe with a paragraph, a sentence. You could say you read and enjoyed but had no comment. Like there's a whole jargon around things like that as well. But just following the threads is quite difficult because of that, because a discussion will go from mailing comment to mailing comment to mailing comment to mailing comment, skipping across like 10 different issues. And so if you want to see the interchange, you kind of have to, take the jigsaw pieces and put them together to actually read what the conversation is. And learning to do that, it's something you need to learn to be able to study these things. Yeah.
Wait, so you've done a lot by now, I assume, because you rely a lot on these zines and newsletters for your scholarship. So, and we were talking before the show started that you collect zines. How many zines do you think you have?
15 or 20,000.
Wow. Yeah. So not, it's, and again, I know that people commend you for your scholarship, but that stuff's going to be just increasingly important as time goes on.
Well, and the good news is a lot of it is being digitized, actually. So when we talk about Alarms, it's much easier to work with because you can just order PDFs of it from Lee Gold. I actually did some of her scans, including her scan of Alarms #1 that she'll give you.
She's still around. Like, yeah. She'll send you PDFs and stuff. Okay. Mm-hmm. Her name comes up a lot. The people. Yeah. So
I was over at her house once with Jason Elliott. She needed us to get some junk out of her garage because her garage was just filled with lots of trash, but it's where all of her old issues of Alarms and Excursions were as well, just lying out in these boxes. And so she made us a deal that if we'd help clean out her garage, we could just take as many issues as we wanted for 50 cents each of anything that we found.
Sold.
Yeah.
Sold.
So we needed a wheelbarrow to get out there at the end of this.
I love that stuff. So now, did she do anything in the zine world beyond Alarms and Excursions, or has that always been her main thing?
I mean, it's her main editorial thing. She still runs it. But of course, she did games for FGU. She did Land of the Rising Sun. There's a bunch of Lands of Adventure. There's a bunch of stuff that she worked on in the early RPG community, other than that. But
nice.
And she, of course, contributed to the other APAs that were out there, to Wild Hunt and Lords of Chaos. And that's the thing, is there's not just one, right? As soon as Alarm started in, June of 75, maybe July. But by January of 1976, there was then a Boston one called The Wild Hunt that was supposed to be the APA for dungeon masters. And so you got to follow all those. And then there was a San Francisco one, Lords of Chaos. You got to follow all those. And then there's Troll Crusher in the UK. And there was APATUD in New York. And there's Morningstar in Australia. And like, so all these kind of started up. And sometimes threads go between them. And so you kind of need to have a picture that goes past all these at the same time. It gets pretty hairy studying those, actually.
Well, I know that you reference zines a lot in your scholarship, and that the Elusive Shift goes in pretty deeply into zines and understanding when did role-playing establish its elusive identity. But I still think it would be fascinating to just see a deep dive just on, let's just talk about zines. And I'm not trying to create work for you. I'm just saying that the idea of somebody putting something like that together and this wonderful enthusiasm, because I can just see your eyes light up when you're talking about, oh, you got to go to here and here and here, and then just, even if I don't know what form it would take, but I would love to see that for zine culture, and there's books out there, there's resources, but I'm talking about like a super scholarly approach to zines, I think would be. But again, I'm not volunteering you for anything.
I mean, I think
thinking out loud.
Yeah, there should be like a wiki or something. I mean, like RPG Geek.
So even that. Yeah, right. Even that.
RPG Geek actually has done a pretty good job of indexing alarms now that it's all available digitally. You can kind of go to RPG Geek and look through the indexes of all these, so you know which ones you want to ask Regold about and things like that. But yeah, I mean, the world of these is so vast. We cataloged these a bit on this old site called Tome of Treasures back in the late 2000s. You can actually, if you go through that, especially these wargaming zines that I was studying in 2007, 2008, when I was really just ramping up to do Playing at the World, I would go through and read them and write little summaries and things like that. So there have been a couple of efforts that have tried to do that, but it is something that would need to be crowdsourced. It is so vast. I mean, I wouldn't do anything else if that's what I was trying to do.
That would be your doing, yeah. I wonder, do you happen to know, has anyone, there's, in recent years, there's been a wonderful slew of documentaries on RPGs. Of course, like I've got one queued up right now on my Amazon, Eye of the Beholder, which is about the art. Yeah, you got Secrets of Blackmoor, which covers sort of the Arneson group, the Blackmoor group's contribution to role playing. I know you got some other ones. I'm not trying to leave anybody off the list. There's several out there. Has The Dreams in Gary's Basement come out yet? I know that ran into some.
It's coming out pretty soon, I think. Actually, okay. I think I'm actually supposed to talk to Pat like this weekend. Now that you mention it, yeah,
cool.
I think he's. Yeah. I don't think they're going to release. I think there's going to be like a pre-thing that's supposed to come out in December, but I think it's scheduled for next year. I don't know.
Well, there's several good. There's even The Dwarvenaut, which is about Stefan.
I saw that. Yeah, I love Stefan. Yeah.
His enthusiasm for gaming is just amazing. But the point is, and I'm not mentioning them all, I'm just, shooting from the hip. There's a wonderful amount of very good documentaries that treat the subject very respectfully on role-playing games. I wonder if anyone's ever done one on the zines. I can't think of one on the zines. That might be interesting if somebody did that. So.
I mean, I spent a lot of the last year really into this year working on a project around dice, right? And I ended up making like a 25-minute video just about how to identify 70s dice. Yeah. I could see easily like spending a year in making like a half an hour thing. It's like, okay, here's some zines. We'll go to this and then do this and then do this.
Right.
But yeah, it's true. It would be, I mean, the problem is it's not super, it's not live actiony, right? I think it's more suitable to something like a wiki or an RPG kind of thing than it is to probably a live action treatment.
Maybe if I get some free time, insert gut laugh here. Maybe I'll help put something like that together. I've increasingly go from being just a player to understanding how important preserving all this is. So I'm trying to, contribute to that where I can. One last little anecdote here on e-zines. It actually came up in the last podcast, but I don't know if you know this story or not. Michael Battalato came across an authentic piece of Gary Gygax and Greyhawk history in a zine. He was kicking around and he found a copy of El Conquistador number 12. and it was a Chicago-based small press magazine for diplomacy players. And Gary had written a story called "The Expedition into the Black Reservoir" for the zine in return for ad space.
Yeah.
And then completely forgot about it. Michael found it, was looking at it, and looked at it and said, you should reach out to Gary on that. And so he did. And Gary was like, I completely forgot that I wrote that. And it turned out to be the first Greyhawk-based fiction ever published. And so that zine has now become, more collectible or whatever. Definitely. But, it just reinforces what we're saying about, these zines are very important.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, my favorite is probably the Great Plains Game Players Newsletter, is what it was called. Jim Lurvy made this in 73 is when it started, and it changed the name to Game Log, I guess, in 76, I want to say. But so many of the early pieces of system that would appear in Greyhawk were the Greyhawk 1975 D&D book were previewed in it. And so you could see the new monsters, you could see the, things about the new combat systems and things like that, all kind of serialized in this very small press, very obscure zine. And that, of course, had the famous story of the Giant's Bag, one of the other original stories. There are only 3 stories in that early period: Black Reservoir, Giant's Bag, and then, the other one's escaping me. I just had it. Giant's Bag, Expedition to the Black Reservoir. There's one more. Oh, yeah, the Lesnard story that's from Wargamers Digest. They were published just in the first, 18 months or so after D&D came out. And, all those are fascinating insights into what the early play was like. And I wish we had more of them from Arneson's side, to be honest. I mean, because it gives you so much of kind of how Lake Geneva saw it.
Yeah, I try to avoid the who contributed more, Arneson or Gygax, because you don't get D&D without both of them coming together.
Yeah.
But I do like to see when more stuff from Arneson's gaming group and his history comes out. I know I've mentioned Secrets of Blackmore a couple of times, but I highly recommend it. It's really fascinating. Like one of the guys in his gaming group was the guy who did Dungeon, the Dungeon board game. And
Dave McGarry.
Dave McGarry. You got David Wesley, contributing, and a lot of that stuff informed the role-playing hobby as a whole. So I got to do this. Like I said, we're going to get to the Elusive Shift, but you keep mentioning stuff that's interesting that I want to talk about. So here's the only 2 trivia things I can tell people about dice. And I love dice. Who doesn't? One of the things that attracted me to D&D in the early 80s and role-playing games in general were these crazy dice. They were part of the mystique of the game. These crazy, and now they're at Walmart. I see campaign dice on the shelves at Walmart, right? But I've heard, and I want you to verify if this is true or not, that the Romans used a D20. I don't know what they used it for, but they found old Roman D20s. Is that a true story?
It is, yeah. And if I can just take a brief digression on that, it's actually what got me started, in the sense of in 2005, I was in the British Museum in London, and I've been playing a lot of World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft had just come out 3 or 4 months before, and actually saw.
Now, you mentioned this in Playing at the World, don't you? Now that I'm thinking about it,
yeah.
Don't you talk about that? Yeah, okay, yeah.
And I saw one of these first century AD Roman 20-sided dice, and I asked myself how far this all went back. Who was the first person that rolled a die against a table of probability to try to decide a fictional event? And that's literally what got me started on this whole thing. Was that? So yeah, those exist. There's Egyptian ones, there's Roman ones, there's all sorts out there.
Okay. But do we know what they were used for?
Not really.
Okay, but they're there. They exist.
They do. People think they were either gambling or divination. Those are the 2 kind of leading contenders. The example that I saw in the British Museum actually had Greek letters on it, which some people lead some people to think more it was for divination, for actually telling fortunes.
Like rune casting or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, something along the... I know the Vikings did the runes, but if you're casting stuff with letters on it. So there's that. And then I also know that, and I think I know this, but I rely on people like you to tell me if this is true, that when Gary started using all these different dice, they were actually educational polyhedral. That's where he was getting them from, was educational supplies. And then he adapted them for use in gaming. Is that true?
It is true-ish. So remember those Western gunfight guys I was just talking about, those British guys?
Yep.
So they actually, as far as I can tell, made the first 20-siders kind of by gamers for gamers that they had made themselves. And interestingly enough, Gary at the time was working on the game that would become Tractix, which was originally released by Gaiden Games, but TSR released a version of it, and something that Gary was working on with a few other local gamers in his Lake Geneva Tactical Studies Association before that became Tactical Studies Rules as such.
Rules, right.
And, they wanted a way to do resolution for percentiles and for 20-sided things. And Gary was reading about the release of this British die in Wargamers newsletter and actually commented, wow, that'd be great. We'd love to have that for this Tractix game we're working on. But yeah, it seems that when Tractix came out, the place that they found that had these was this company called Creative Publications, which was in Palo Alto. And there was a guy there named Dale Seymour who had been interested in educational tools. He actually worked at the junior high school there in Palo Alto at the time, and had put out books that had how to assemble the Platonic solids out of like cardboard. I mean, it would be little like punch outs that you could like put together for a polyhedra. But eventually he sourced from Hong Kong these numbered polyhedral dice that they sold as educational tools around 1972. And that's really where Gaiden Games picked those up and started reselling them for Tractix just to give you the D20. But then Gary was kind of like, okay, what do we do with the rest of these dice? And started exploring the possibilities. What do you do with the D8? What do you do with the D12? What do you do with the D4? And that's really where how those things ended up getting into D&D.
Cool. And they're considered. When did the term Platonic? So was the term Platonic solid? Was that used in math or geometry a long time before they started getting used as dice? I mean,
yeah.
Do we know? Okay.
Plato wrote a dialogue called the Timaeus back in the day. This would, be in the BC era, that actually talked about the properties of the 5 regular polyhedras, we call them, which are, polyhedra, we define them as ones where every vertex and edge has the same relationship to their center of gravity. There are only 5 shapes that have that property and that therefore roll fairly as dice. The cube is the famous one, but it's true of all the other ones as well. Not that D4s really roll as dice, right? But it's still true that they have that same kind of relationship.
They have that, yeah. So you got the D4, or the sort of a pyramid. You got the cube. You got and they've got names like dodecahedron and all that. But you got the 8-sider, the 12-sider, and the 20-sider. Basically, what I'm looking at here. I'd heard that term Platonic solid before, but not being a mathematician, I never really paid much attention to it.
Yeah, the Timaeus was a dialogue that was about the fundamental structure of reality, and in it, Plato is talking about kind of which of the elements are made up of these kinds of shapes. And this may sound really fanciful to us now, but he imagined that fire was made up of little D4s because it was prickly. Right, and that Earth was made up of 6-siders, and that the water was made up of 20-siders because they rolled a lot, right? And the air, for whatever reason, was made up of 8-siders. But famously, the 5th element, right, was the dodecahedron, I believe. I may be a little rusty in my Timaeus, but that is I believe the origin of why we call these Platonic solids, because they're all defined as being related to the elements, including the mysterious ether that was out there that nobody had managed to tap into.
That's fascinating. I love the idea that Plato was like, these are the fundamental bricks of reality, if you will, and these dice are some of the fundamental elements of gaming reality. I love that unintentional sort of overlap there. I think that's really beautiful, actually. So okay. Well, I'm gonna.
We got a pretty far range on our conversation today.
Yeah, well, that's what I like to do with my show. So when I have people like you on, I'm not gonna stick to just one topic. I'm gonna go wherever it goes. So what I want to do is I'm going to take a quick break and do some show notes, and when we get back, we're going to continue talking with Jon about a cookbook that is RPG related, and then also the Elusive Shift, the book that is forthcoming that is has prompted this particular discussion. So we'll be talking about that as soon as we get back from the show notes. Oh yeah, baby, let's do some show notes. All right, first, speaking of notes, the notes and links and that sort of thing for every episode of Shane Plays Geek Talk are posted at shaneplays.com. That's ShanePlays.com. So if you hear something discussed during the show, you want to know more about it, just go to shaneplays.com. Our previous episode is posted there, of course. That's episode 234, OSR Gaming and Frog God Games with Michael Battalato and Carl Heil. It was a great show. Go check it out if you haven't already. The podcast can be found in multiple places, including on the blog at shaneplays.com, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, YouTube, and more. Yes, I put it on YouTube, just the audio. Some people do like to listen that way. Shane Plays is also carried on Krypton Radio. Krypton Radio is sci-fi for your Wi-Fi. KryptonRadio.com. If you'd like to support Shane Plays Geek Talk, we do have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/ShanePlays. You can also follow my Twitter accounts. Yes, accounts. You can follow ShanePlays, that's Shane Plays, ShanePlays, or Shane Plays PR, ShanePlays PR. Now, Shane Plays is my chatty Twitter. I'm just constantly yakking and posting whatever comes into my fevered little brain. While Shane Plays PR is just the meat and potatoes. It's links to the show or announcements or whatever, but it's much less active. So if you want to stay in touch with Shane Plays, but don't want every little thing, just follow Shane Plays PR. And I post all kinds of cool stuff on those Twitters, including affiliate links and other news that can help you get cool stuff either for free or save some money. So let me explain what I mean by that. Just lately, I've posted multiple Humble Bundles for books, games. Right here, I'm looking right now, there's a Humble Game Dev Map and Level Creator bundle. So if you're a game dev, you got that. There's books on programming and hacking. I just posted a news that the Dragonlance lawsuit has been dismissed. Epic Game Store is giving away really good free games for 15 days during the Christmas season. So there's just all kinds of cool stuff on here that you want to check out. So, it could benefit you to follow these Twitter accounts is what I'm trying to say. Also, don't forget, got my book out there with my friend Matt Barton of Matt Chat, Dungeons and Desktops, The History of Computer Role-Playing Games, 2nd edition, which is a very cool book. I was honored to be a part of that. And just go to shaneplays.com and it's linked there. Any show notes page will have it and you can check it out. And last but never least, I want to give a shout out to advertising partner Cursova Magazine. Cursova Adventure Fiction Magazine has cool sci-fi and fantasy and pulp fiction. I've seen them do D&D related stuff. It's really carrying the torch of those really, like amazing stories and those sort of pulp fiction magazines of the past that so much interesting and important stories were published in. So check it out. That's Cursova Magazine, CIRSOVA Magazine. Okay, folks, that's the show notes. Thanks for listening to Shane Plays Geek Talk, and we will return to our conversation with Jon Peterson about the Elusive Shift. All right, that's it for the show notes, and now we are continuing our discussion with Jon Peterson. So we are definitely going to talk about the Elusive Shift before we wrap up, but I also wanted to give you a chance to let people know about another project you've been involved with recently that is a cookbook. Why don't you tell us something about that?
I know. It seems kind of weird that I'm doing a cookbook, doesn't it? So this is something that after we did this book in 2018 called Art and Arcana, we were working with 10-Speed Press, which is a division of Penguin Random House. But 10-Speed publishes a lot of cookbooks, and a lot of ones that are actually quite prominent. Like they publish Barefoot Contessa series, which are, #1 bestsellers, like all the time, things like that. And so actually they had the idea that they should do a D&D cookbook. Wizards thought that was a cool idea. And because we just worked with them on Art and Arcana, they asked us if we would like to help. And so I was glad to help, myself and Kyle Newman and Mike Whitwer. Unfortunately, Sam Whitwer, Mike's brother, who worked with us on Art and Arcana, he had some other commitments, so he couldn't pitch in on this one. But we got together and just started mining D&D source books for information about what the various fantasy cultures ate, right? What do elves eat? What do hobbits eat? What do dwarves eat? And kind of what would the more uncommon races eat, right? What do dragonborn eat? What do tieflings eat? Things like that. And so we went back through all the novels we could find, all the modules we could find, anything that was in any of the main source books, and tried to come up with, concepts, right? For, okay, here are some things that, fit with this. Now, fortunately, none of us are chefs. None of us design food professionally. So actually 10 Speed engaged with Adam Reed from America's Test Kitchen to help do the recipe part of it. And so we didn't really, figure out how many, spoonfuls of this you should use in order to make this taste right and things like that. But we had a bit of input into, conceptually what these should be and how they should turn out. And it was really fun. I mean, I do so much serious, crunchy stuff that, having a break and just really be okay, we're going to do a fun project. It's not going to require a ton of research and, there's a lot of photography that went into it. So we had great fun actually shooting the pictures of the food. And afterwards, of course, we got to eat the food, which was pretty cool because they had real food preparers figuring out how to make the dishes, right? But we brought all kinds of props. I brought from my house all kinds of swords and shields and coins and stuff like that just ends up being on the table with some of this stuff. And so it was just a lot of fun.
It sounds really fun. And that book is out now. It's been out for a few months. Did it come out in October?
That's right.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. Yeah. And it was I talked with you and Kyle and Mike about doing a show on that. And, totally, I think that would be a lot of fun to have you on.
Definitely.
And talk about maybe I could try a couple of recipes first and then have you on and tell you what I thought. So I wonder what you said. It was Adam Reeves of
Adam Reed.
Test Kitchen.
Yeah,
Adam Reed. I wonder was he thinking on some of this stuff what in the world have I gotten into? Unicorn haunch. Where do I get unicorn haunch?
And so there was a lot of we had a lot of choices, I'll put it that way, in terms of how to approach this. We certainly could have gone down the route of this is supposed to be basilisk meat, right? And this is how you prepare it. But, I think we eventually decided that was kind of cheesy. And so really it's things you're supposed to be able to make. There are some cases in it, even things like venison, for example, we didn't want to, even though it's referenced so much in the books, so much venison is eaten by Drizzt, right? If you go through the old Icewind Dale books, we didn't want to make this prohibitively difficult for people to make in their homes.
So instead of venison, it's just beef
Yeah, we have some that's an option. You can use venison for this if you can get it. But it's intended to be stuff you can actually make. It really only gets fanciful in the drinks. And I did work a bit on the drinks section, I will confess. So you'll, a lot of the actual meals are more down to earth, but the drinks are things like the Mind Flayer, the Delayed Blast Fireball, which is a cinnamon fireball whiskey kind of thing. There's that
sounds like a lot of fun. Yeah. What kind of reception have you had on it? Do people like it? Have you gotten some feedback?
Yeah, it was on the New York Times bestseller list for 4 weeks, which is a pretty good indication.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So, that's fantastic. It's a fun idea. It's one of those ideas you don't think of, and then somebody does it, and you're like, that's kind of crazy. That sounds kind of fun. So,
I wouldn't have thought of it myself. Like I said, it was entirely somebody else's idea. I was just parachuted in. Can you help? And I was like, sure. Yeah, I can help.
Sure, why not? Yeah, it's fun. Like I said, it gave you a break from the super hard. Even though it sounds like y'all did some serious research going through and trying to find, actual stuff from D&D lore that, you could reference. So did you do that in the book? Did you say this recipe was referenced in this module? Did y'all go that deep?
We didn't, but you'll know. If you're a D&D person, we kind of liked it better that way rather than giving you footnotes. Some of them are pretty obscure. There's a lot of Easter eggs. I had fun designing some of the super obscure ones. Probably my favorite of those is the orc bacon, which is actually an in-joke. And I put this up on Twitter. If you look through my Twitter feed, I'm sure you can find it. We have a recipe for orc bacon that is because there was a time when TSR licensed the rights to Oscar Mayer in Europe to make D&D branded meat products, including bacon. And this was something the TSR staff thought was hilarious. And so they have all these references to orc bacon as a licensed product and some like TSR internal stuff. And so I had to make sure there was an orc bacon recipe that was in there to just reference that.
Great. That's pretty great. All right. Well, hopefully we'll get a chance to get the crew together and talk about that.
Yeah, definitely love to.
Deeper. I'll reach out to them, and if you feel like doing so as well. I know we had an initial discussion. It was like, yeah, let's do it. And then for whatever reason we didn't. But
I mean, part of it too is with COVID and all that. I know that we did, we did like a book tour for Arcana, right? I mean, we spoke at Pixar and Lucasfilm and Google, and like it was, we were all over the place doing this stuff. We were at Comic-Con in San Diego and New York, and and you can't do that now. And I think really a lot of the media things got scaled back. But for you, who have been such a friend and booster to us, I'm sure we would love to come on your show and just rap about it.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Well, I boost you guys because the stuff you do is cool and I respect it, but I appreciate that. All right. Well, let's talk about the Elusive Shift. So what I'm going to do, I got an email, John, from MIT Press. Okay. And I'm going to read a little bit of that. Okay. And then I'm going to let you add whatever you want to add after I read the official stuff here. So December 22nd sees the release of an exciting new book about the early Dungeons & Dragons communities from New York Times best-selling author and leading D&D scholar Jon Peterson. The Elusive Shift, How Role-Playing Games Forged Their Identity, explores how the early Dungeons & Dragons community grappled with the nature of role-playing games, theorizing a new game genre. And then a little further here it says, when Dungeons & Dragons made its debut in the mid-1970s, followed shortly thereafter by other similar tabletop games, it sparked a renaissance in game design and critical thinking about games. D&D is now popularly considered to be the first role-playing game, but in the original rules, the term quote-unquote role-playing is nowhere to be found. D&D was marketed as a war game. In The Elusive Shift, Jon Peterson describes how players and scholars in the D&D community, and really let's say the role-playing community. I know that D&D is important for marketing because that's what most people think of, but I know that your scope is much larger than just the D&D community. Scholars in the D&D community began to apply the term to D&D and similar games, and by doing so, establish a new genre of games. Now, here's the important thing. Peterson examines key essays by role-playing game early adopters, rescuing from obscurity many first published and now defunct fanzines. We talked earlier about the importance of fanzines. He traces the evolution of how role-playing was theorized as writers attempted to frame problems, define terms, and engage with prior literature. He describes the trend cultures of wargames and science fiction fandom. And I want to point out that their wargaming culture often gets its respect for contributing to role-playing. The science fiction fandom, not as much, but it's very, very important. Science fiction fandom that influences the first role players examines the dialogue at the core of the game, explains how game design began to accommodate role playing, and considers the purpose of the referee or games master. By 1977, game scholars and critics began to theorize more systematically, and Peterson explores the discussions of the transformative nature of role-playing games, the responsibility to a mass audience, and other topics. Peterson finds that the foundational concepts defined in the 1970s helped theorize role-playing, laying the foundation for the genre shift into maturity in the 1980s. Okay, so that's what MIT is telling people, MIT Press. That's the press release, if you will. What would you like to add or expound on that, John?
I mean, it's pretty good. I think I may have written some of that. I don't remember. But yeah, I mean, it really is a book that tries to recapture what it felt like, right? And to be in 1976, 1977, and to be hashing through these games and trying to figure out how to play them. And I mean, I guess I'd say that a lot of what turned into theorizing about RPGs started with people who disagreed when they came to the tabletop about what they were trying to do, right? And, that the disagreements about that ended up sparking a lot of the early theorizing as people tried to figure out why isn't this working when you get these like two different groups together who have these completely different play styles. And, we were talking earlier about Alarms and Excursions and Lee Gold and that crew. They firmly came out of science fiction fandom, right? I mean, it's not that they were unaware that there were war games, but they were people who were dedicated to the science fiction fandom community. And, early on, they had a sense maybe that it was more of the DM's job, to cooperate with the players, to help them get to to the goals that they were trying to accomplish, to make it a thrilling ride along the way, but for it to be very collaborative. Whereas when Leagold went and played, say, with the players at Caltech, who came much more from a wargaming background, she said there she felt like the referee was playing much more against the players. And these perceptions of difference that emerged early on started to sketch this divide. And I call this in the Elusive Shift the two cultures, right, between wargaming and science fiction fandom. Because when you look at an early essay by, for example, my friend Lou Pulsifer, and I don't know if Lou Pulsifer's name is terribly well known. You can find his stuff. He writes on Gamma Sutra these days, I believe. But he was responsible for a lot of diplomacy variant categorization, and he did Valley of the Four Winds with Games Workshop. He was in the UK for a bit as a grad student. But, Lou wrote for the first issue of White Dwarf, right, when Games Workshop started White Dwarf. And he wrote an article there about D&D philosophy, in which he said he perceived this vast distinction between people who wanted to play D&D like it was a game and people who wanted to play it like it was a fantasy novel. And that's his starting, in D&D philosophy, there is this fundamental division. And my argument in the Elusive Shift is that comes back to those two cultures that got imported.
So you're not inventing a new distinction. I mean, one of the first issue of White Dwarf has this distinction in it.
In 1977, yeah. So I'm not in the job, by the way, and this is something I should say about Elusive Shift. I'm not trying to articulate some new theory of RPGs. I'm not, this is not an armchair exercise in what I think this is a history book. I write history. And so this is really about that process and the documentation of that process by which people started to navigate. Is this supposed to be played like a game, like a war game, or is this more like, kind of collaborative novel that you're trying to negotiate together? And what system properties would differ from those two approaches? And so you see this very, very early on. I was talking about Ed Symbolist earlier and Chivalry and Sorcery. When you roll for intelligence in a game like Chivalry and Sorcery, what does it really mean when you have, as a player, a character with a low intelligence stat? Does that mean you're supposed to be an idiot and you're supposed to say, well, I can't figure out how to open a door, and so I bump my head against it because it's funny to do that, right? There were people who adopted that philosophy, looking at what it meant to have characteristics. But then there were other people, again, with the more kind of wargaming philosophy, who looked at intelligence as well. This is a measure of how well my character can use spells or learn languages or whatever. But as a player, I'm still going to use my best tactical judgment about how to direct that particular character's actions. And that's one of the starkest and earliest, most fundamental distinctions you see is between people who thought, you should ignore rolled intelligence as a player versus people who thought, oh, rolled intelligence means as a player, I need to act super differently and I need to make my character do things very differently. And some people said only the latter of those was really role-playing. And that if you weren't doing that, you weren't role-playing, right? You start to see this discussion very early on. You see this in 1976 already.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And that's why the kind of work you're doing is important, because there's a lot of people, including myself, although I've been disabused of this notion over my years of, with your scholarship and talking to others and researching RPGs, I imprinted on role-playing games a certain way in the early 80s. And in my mind, that's how role-playing games were. That's what a role-playing game was. And then to me, it seems like things are changing as time goes on. But really, it's kind of not. There may be a shift between how many people adopt one play style versus another, but the fundamental core differences in what people perceive or want out of it have been there since the beginning. And that's, to me, that's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think the way that I put it in the epilogue, which is the only place I really looked beyond 1980 or so, I think people understood the problem well enough by 1980 that there were these distinctions, and there were people who were trying to figure out how can we make the referee have less power, right, over and have events be more player driven, for example. But it's not like they designed Apocalypse World or Fiasco, or, you know, these very modern RPGs like that, like back in the 1970s, they didn't know the kinds of solutions that people would later apply. And I think Apocalypse World is a very different game, right, from what anybody would have been doing in the 1970s. But I think they got the problem. and I think we experimented with a whole bunch of potential solutions for that, and those have varied quite a bit since the 1970s. But what I'm really trying to get at in this, it's more about, you know, the theorizing, is that people got theoretically, you know, that there were these trade-offs, and, you know, we're experimenting with ways to try to resolve them. And I think they realized as well that no solution was going to work for everyone, right?
Right.
The same way that back in 1971, the guy was like, well, some wargamers want to just do super simulation, and some want to do super competitive things, and some just want to have fun. Like, there's no one true way.
Right. And one of the things that has really surprised me, in a good way, even though, you know, not every innovation or every change or every movement in the hobby I agree with, but the hobby keeps iterating and iterating far beyond what I would have expected, as far as what games are being designed and the mechanics and this and that and the other. And, you know, I think to really get that true innovation, you have to have new generations come in with a fresh look. Because even if you're in 1980 and you realize there's a problem, or even not a problem, just an opportunity to do something different, you're still entrenched in kind of the environment you're in. And so there's solutions that may not ever occur to you, right? So, but then you get 20 years later, you get somebody, you know, 30 years later or whatever, who's never played a role-playing game, starts playing one for the first time, and they got a whole different way of looking at things. And I've really been pleasantly surprised. I would never, even though I loved role-playing games growing up and still do, I would have never thought that role-playing games would be as big as they are now, have the impact they do on culture, and have iterated as much as they've had. I mean, there's, like, if you go to, I don't know if it's on itch.io, there is a massively amazing and vibrant indie RPG community out there. I mean, you got people designing games that only like 10 people are playing, but they keep making that game for those 10 people. And there's some crazy cool games out there. You know, it's almost like the indie video games thing. You know, there's just some really crazy cool stuff that we're going to see bubble into the quote unquote mainstream RPGs over the next 5, 10, 20 years. So I'm really intrigued and encouraged to see, you know, all the stuff going on out there in the hobby.
Yeah, and it is amazing how, you know, the smallest idea can, you know, start in one place, start in one small press game or whatever, and then become something that is just de rigueur in modern games. Like, I write a lot about the development of fame and fortune points for Top Secret, in part because, you know, the development of those really refer to the fact that, you know, when Merle Rasmussen was making Top Secret, you know, he didn't think saving throws made sense for James Bond, right? They didn't make sense for the kind of secret agent game he wanted to have. But he came up with this notion, okay, maybe there's this resource, you know, that's called like fortune points that you have when you're first starting out. And you can spend a fortune point if you're going to be shot and killed. And the fortune point means that, okay, I didn't actually get shot and killed. I got lucky this time. But as you get more famous, the way James Bond is famous, you have fame points. And if just some punk like takes a shot at you that would blow your head off, well, James Bond is too famous to die that way, right? And like, so you can spend a fame point, and this is very much a story mechanic, not a physical world property modeling mechanic, right? You can spend a fame point to prevent that from happening to James Bond. But like, people picked that up and like started figuring out an economy for that, this idea of hero points that ended up in the James Bond 007 Victory Games version. And that turned into every fate point, every inspiration point you now see in 5th edition came out of this kind of seed of an idea. Well, maybe saving throws aren't quite the right mechanic. I'll start with this. And from there, it just blossomed into something that's now a feature of a burning wheel. You know, take your pick. Like, you know, you can hardly design an RPG anymore without a mechanic like that in it.
Right. So it's basically codifying plot armor in a way. I mean, it's like, you know, you don't want your hero taken out by one lucky shot from some goofy henchman, right? Or tripping over a rock while he's trying to climb the, you know, whatever and plummets 100 feet and dies.
But it's
So,
not.
yeah,
It's
you're
not
right.
just. But it's not just the bunnies and burrows referee fudging the saving throw anymore, right? It's a mechanic. It's a system. It's something somebody
Yeah,
designed.
the player has
that
the
you-
player can
Yeah.
right.
And so that's
Yeah.
what made it, I think, so attractive and so disruptive and so influential. So yeah, tracing things like that, these little ideas, they'll start in some random game. Yeah, they then get picked up and end up everywhere.
Yeah, and that stuff bubbles up from, a lot of times what would be very edge case games, people latch. Like I don't know what game it originated in, but I've heard people kind of walk me through, and I just forget the details right now. Like advantage disadvantage is a fantastic mechanic in 5e. I think it's one of the best parts of 5e. It's instead of keeping up with all the modifiers and negative, you have. But somebody walked me through one time and said, well, that came from here, and then it came to here, and then it made it into 5e. So, a lot of times newer editions of games are taking what has been proven, or at least similar concepts that have been proven in other games, and bringing it into, a new version of a game. So, but anyway, yeah, there's so much cool stuff going on out there. Now, taking it back to the Elusive Shift, like you said, it's kind of like if people finished, or whether they finished playing at the World or not, it kind of picks up the story where Playing at the World finishes and kind of carries it forward. I believe.
I mean, it does that chapter about the two cultures. The first chapter is kind of, I call it a fentanyl concentration rehash of Playing at the World. Perhaps like that first chapter reprises a lot of the stuff that's in chapters 3 and 4 of Playing at the World, which not a lot of people make it through, I can say. But yeah, it's intended to pick up where it left off and just extend the storyline a few more years, but all tied into this theme, to this idea of whether or not people really managed to capture what the difference was between the games that they were playing now and the previous activities and wargaming and science fiction fandom, and in such a way that they defined this new genre sufficiently. And I don't tend to like to give pat answers, so don't expect a pat answer in this book. Don't expect a crisp dictionary definition of what a role-playing game is. That's kind of not how I roll. But expect a lot of historical sources and people talking about these things, me citing how people engage with this, and maybe just trying to draw a few lessons about how it got as messy as it is and why this shift really was so elusive.
I feel like the messiness has made the hobby better rather than detracted from it.
It has.
Right? Even though we like things to be clear and pat and to get an easy answer, I used to think, and a lot of people still think this, because I was told back in the day that you had wargaming, and then you had chainmail, and then you had D&D, and that was how it all happened, And yeah, kind of, maybe a little bit, but no, not really. So I love learning all of and then, people are like, no, there's always been debates over whether we should do this or that or the other. So can you tell, do you have like one story or one anecdote when you were researching for this book that surprised you? Maybe you got surprised?
I mean, like I said, the Ed Symbolist one was a pretty choice one for me. Everything I've talked about here is in it. All that stuff I was just saying about fame points and fortune points, this is all just me telling stuff that's in the book. Okay. Is there anything else that I was like super surprised by?
Did you find during your research because I've had people tell me back in the day that they won D&D. Did you find that elusive winning D&D button in any of your research?
I mean, definitely there were a lot of people talking about the victory conditions of D&D. I talk a lot about how, D&D doesn't really tell you what the object of the game is, right? Right. And it really isn't until Tunnels and Trolls that Ken St. Andre comes out and says the object of the game is to become as much of a super person as you can. And you hear Gary say more or less the same thing, that progression is the actual object of play in D&D. But then, of course, people substituted in all sorts of other victory conditions. There were people early on, and this is exactly the kind of dialogue and narrative that I follow, who argued that the search for experience points impedes role-playing. It makes you not be in character, to be focused on accumulating.
Right, because you're seeing everything as a bag of XP. like it becomes that Knights of the Dinner Table lampoon kind of style of, where they're always, how much XP is that thing worth? I'm taking it out,
And, and so people started asking what would be a better way to do this. And people made tables you could roll for what your character's goal is when you're starting out. Is your character's goal to avenge, their father's death? Is it to, find a bride out in the world? Is it to take over the world? Like you can kind of roll for those kinds of things. But pretty soon people are asking, well, why don't players just say what it is that they want to do and have that be a hook that's like inputted to the referee, and it's kind of the referee's job to collaboratively with them help them find a way to that, or at least a chance of succeeding at that.
There's games out there where, and I'm not talking about session 0, that's a different thing, but there's games out there where the first session is the players describing the world they want and collaborative. I mean, and even saying and getting a chance to like, well, I'm going to invent this part of the realm. I mean, there's games out there where the players have a lot of input on the campaign world, what the campaign is about. And then of course you have session 0, which is I wonder who came up with that. To talk about innovations, I mean, that's a wonderful innovation, the session 0. Have you ever come across who first came up with that?
I mean, you definitely see people who are describing, as I said, that you should figure out what your goals are as a character beforehand. The notion that is like cordoned off into a session, I'm not sure any game before 1980 really recommended that you do that. You find a lot of these things too in like slightly different forms. I mean, a good example of that would be Rule 0, right? Session 0 reminds me of Rule 0. We talk a lot about Rule 0. The notion that like if a rule doesn't make sense, throw it out and do what does make sense. It's like the number one thing to do refereeing. And, trying to find the origins of that is something I do in the Elusive Shift. Again, I think there's a gamer's first law that Ed Symbolist proposed that has pretty much precisely that form. So I go after a lot of those early concepts. I don't know if Session 0 is one of them, though.
I only heard of it as an actual codified thing, like, just within the past few years, but I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
There's some people say you can't play a game without it. I don't agree with that because we did it for 4 decades, but it's a wonderful innovation and I recommend it, Well, so tell us, kind of wrap it up here. When will the Elusive Shift, no, let me back up. December 22nd is when the Elusive Shift comes out. What kind of availability will it have? Is it going to be all over Amazon, this and that? Like, how can people get the Elusive Shift?
Yeah, you should be able to get it anywhere you can get books these days, especially in this COVID era. So MIT Press, as you mentioned, is added their game history series, so it will be available on the Amazons and the Barnes and Nobles and everywhere else. If you Google it, it's not hard to find already. So,
can you tease us with any future upcoming projects? You got anything already in the? I know you said you got the videos on the dice and stuff like that you're working on. Is there
that's
anything else
out.
that you want to?
The dice video came
Okay.
out in like February, I think, actually, a while ago. Yeah, so there's an article on my blog now that has like a quick reference guide to it. Yeah, that's something I spent like a year working on. That's like a super complicated project to try to figure out.
I don't know how I missed that because I subscribe to your blog and I always try to promote it out. So somehow I missed that one.
I don't blog that often these days, to be honest. Yeah. I mean, just I'm trying to write more than that. So, yeah, I have like 3 more projects that I'm working on at the moment, but I don't think anything I'd really want to telegraph today. So.
Okay, no problem. All right, so the Elusive Shift. And what's that after the colon there? It's the Elusive Shift.
How role-playing games forge their identity.
That's a great cover. So what is that? That's it's like a dragon kind of coming into being. It's like a maze leading to a dragon, but it's all one piece of art. So it's kind of showing you had to go through all this maze of stuff to get to what the dragon was, right? That's a nice idea. That
is indeed what it is. And it's supposed to look kind of retro, like the fonts and the way it kind of pops. So I like it. I don't know. It's nice to not have to do these things myself. Other people do the covers.
Somebody, they do the graphic design. Well, it's a nice eye catcher, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. So, all right, man. Well, John, any last thoughts or anything else, anything at all you want to throw out there?
I mean, all I'd like to say is thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure to rap with you, and happy to come back anytime.
Likewise, and now that you've said that, I have to change your happiness into regret because I have to give you the bad joke of the week.
Uh-oh. Go
Yeah,
on.
here we go. Here we go. The bad joke of the week. How do you know if your magic sword is blunt?
How do you know if your magic sword is blunt? I don't know. How do you know?
It starts critiquing your form during combat.
I see. So it's an intelligent sword, yes, and it's got its commentary. It's ego.
got-
It's a high ego sword, and it's like, you
Yep.
are not worthy to wield me.
You're not. Yeah, it's like, I can't believe you just did that. Okay, so here's another one because that one was really bad. Okay, if a drummer comes out of retirement, will there be repercussions?
This is terrible. This is terrible.
See, that's the response. I'll give you one more. An
Really?
apology written in dots and dashes is remorse code
Remorse code.
because it's an apology. See,
You know, I think I'm retracting my offer to reappear on your show, actually. At this point, but
it's all done in love. I love a bad joke.
Yes.
Everybody should love a bad joke.
I'm feeling show appearing remorse. So
Yeah, it's probably an actual physical allergic reaction. So these bad jokes are carefully cultivated to induce actual physical trauma. So, all right, man, we'll have a very Merry Christmas and holiday season.
You too.
And I'm looking forward to reading this book. I told Helen over at MIT Press that I would definitely get the word out. So I will keep my word to her and to you. So anyway, man, thanks for everything you do. Have fun, in our COVID life. And everybody else, we will catch you next time on Shane Plays. Thanks so much for listening.
Shane Plays Radio is blessed to have sponsors, and we appreciate them very much. However, did you know that you can also support the show as an individual for as little as $1 an episode? Simply go to patreon.com/ShanePlays.